All right, here we go. Okay, Jason, I'm so glad to have some time with you. Really,
Yeah,
I've read some of your stuff and I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say.
thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to have a chance to talk. I think we probably both owe maybe Father Kenneth Tanner the thanks for. I think that's where we connected, isn't it?
Oh, really?
I bet so. Yeah, and yeah, I've been following your stuff too. So yeah, it'll be fun to have a chat. I'm looking forward to this.
Awesome. So, how about you just tell us a little bit about you and like where you live, what your life's like,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm Reverend Jason Dillingham, but you don't have to call me by that. I grew up in West Michigan. Actually, grew up in Muskegon, so I'm a lover of all things at the beach. Um, I'm married and have 4 kids, from middle school up to young adult. We have moved a number of times. I began my journey, my faith journey, I guess you would say, as a child. My parents enrolled me in a Lutheran parochial school for elementary school. So I had Bible class 5 days a week. But then I went to a public high school, and things changed in our lives. And it was the satanic panic of the 80s. And I was an artist who played Dungeons and Dragons, and the church made it very clear that there was no place for anyone like me in the church. So I was like, okay, fine, there's no place for you in my life either. Um, I was an artist. I took vocational graphic arts through 2 years of high school. Um, Immediately, I started working for a newspaper. I had, in my graphic arts career, I worked for 2 newspapers, a design firm, and a couple of retail quick print places. Um, Always wanted to be an illustrator, but back in the day, the counselor said, you're not going to make any money, so be a graphic artist. So I did that instead.
Mhm.
Um, I have always loved the creative, fantastical, fictional, just the way that art interacts with life and life interacts with art. Um, and I went to a year of college and then didn't really know how to progress from there. So I joined the Army. My father had been in the Army. So I joined the Army, and I was a military policeman for 4 years at the end of the Cold War and during Desert Storm. I served with 3rd Armored Division um, over in Desert Storm. Came back home and was living my life. Um, Got married. Um, and when I got married, my wife really insisted on getting married in a church, and I wanted nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing to do with that. But because I loved her, I agreed with it. Um, and 5 years later, I look back and all the photos, there's a cross over our shoulder in every single one. And I just, that 5-year anniversary, I just wept, realizing that God had been there, even though I had not been favorable to God's presence at all. So our second child was born in 2003 with double pneumothorax. If I'm saying that right, he had a hole in each of his lungs at birth, and that was my um, Damascus Road encounter. I literally had a spiritual, out of this world kind of on my knees in the bathroom on the side of the tub praying, and encountered Christ, who called me back to faith and called me into the ministry, which was not something I ever thought I would do. So we went back to, a friend of ours invited us to a local Lutheran church, and that was familiar to me. So we went, and we were there for a while, and that pastor became my first mentor. Started doing some lay ministry training. He left to go do something else and kind of held me up as, here's your next guy, who'll take care of you. They were really angry at him for leaving, so they skewered us. So I said, okay, I'm not going to be the one to upset things. So I went to go be on staff at a church plant in Comstock, Michigan, Comstock Park, Michigan, which is right outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. Served there for a while. Then things just got hard for us. And so I went back to my graphic design work. And we were worshiping in one community, living in another community, and working in another community. And as a result, we had no community at all of our own.
Mm-hmm.
So we found a local church that seemed to fit us. Come to find out, it was a Wesleyan church. I had no idea what that meant, but we started going there. And then that pastor took me under his wing, and I continued ministry training there. In 2010, I lost my job and my house as part of the real estate bubble bursting. Thankfully, I got part of the no worker left behind, in the state of Michigan gave me unemployment as I went to Indiana and did my training for ordination, which I thought was pretty amazing.
Yes.
We made it through that whole journey, and I got ordained in the Wesleyan church, and had a few jobs there. It grew increasingly uncomfortable for me, this denomination where I felt like I was coming home. I increasingly felt like an outsider. God was working on me and opening up my heart in ways I had been. So I'd been in the Missouri Synod branch of the Lutheran Church. So I was very conservative. I had come out of the U.S. Army, so I was very patriotic. And all that plays into that nationalism and conservatism. And when I started to study Jesus in earnest for ordination, Jesus broke all of that open and compelled me to a much more progressive worldview. And so I had to continue on that path. Thankfully, the Spirit did a number on me to take me along the journey to being affirming before one of my oldest child came out. And so in 2016, the Wesleyan Church added language to their discipline that made it very clear that I could no longer in good conscience minister there. And that journey took a little bit of time. I ended up ministering in a congregational church, and I guess the rebelliousness of that tradition sort of fit me a little bit. And so I have been, this last year, I've been on a journey of discernment moving toward the UCC, United Church of Christ. I have founded a congregation of my own where we could be overtly affirming and extravagantly welcoming, where we could do a thing. I had been learning that dinner church was one of the ways that churches were really succeeding in this environment, and we had done a free community meal every week, and that was one of the strongest parts. We could just sense God in it as we were doing it, and so we continued to do that. Now, I founded that church in January of 2020. By March 15th, we were all under COVID quarantine, had to wrestle with how to be an embodied community in a disembodied world. Eventually, we settled on Zoom, and we did that for a while until we could start gathering outside, and loved gathering outside, even though the weather would make it really tricky from week to week whether it was going to be good for us or not. But it put us in a place where we encountered a number of people that we never would have encountered inside the walls of a church. So now the weather in Michigan is turning. It's a beautiful sunny day today, but it's been getting cold on us and raining, and so we have we're going to walk alongside ministry of the local Episcopalian church, and we're going to meet in their parish hall and try and revitalize some of our dinner church practices, and our openly affirming and extravagantly welcoming. So I'm interim pastor at one United Church of Christ church, about a half an hour north of here, and still continuing to build up and gather this community of it's funny. The first time I said it, I was really self-conscious about saying it and not wanting to hurt everyone, but they loved it and they adopted it, and we call ourselves the Island of Misfit Toys.
Love it.
From the old Rudolph
Oh,
Christmas.
totally. I'm a big fan of
Yeah.
that show.
So they just adopted that idea, and a bunch of people who aren't good enough to go to church gathering together for church, because we're just trying to be like Jesus, and to be love and welcome and grace in a world. It's not easy because it's a largely conservative, semi-rural community, and so that's where we are. I probably got preacher disease there.
That's good.
Help me, I'm talking and I can't shut up. But I mean, yeah, in a nutshell, that gives you sort of a time frame, just maybe a framework, and we can talk about some of maybe the more significant stuff that moved me along the pathway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm really interested in how dancing with Jesus, whatever you call it, has really overtly along the way. It's really amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's biblical.
I think so, which is funny because in the church these days, it seems like we're having a big fight between sort of this nationalistic evangelicalism and maybe like the red letter Christians, the ones who are just really overtly trying to follow the words and teachings and life example of Jesus. Realizing that's, that sounds like I'm favoring where we are in a dualistic kind of way. And I don't mean to do that, but.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I served in the US Army, and I am a war veteran. I do love my country. I think that it's a beautiful experiment that hasn't yet realized the potential of the ideals that we were founded on, and that we should never stop reaching for those ideals. So I very much want to be involved in that journey. But also I've come to the place where I would say, no king but Jesus, and that my citizenship, albeit temporarily American, is permanently in the people of God. And so there's this sort of prima facie, this highest ideal that is to be Christ-like, to embody mercy and grace, and that doesn't have borders and nations, and so this idea of being on the side of the poor and the hungry and the homeless, and we've been there. Like I said, we lost our house actually over the last year, because I had been in a church that had a parsonage, and we had to get out of there. When you're a pastor with a parsonage, you lose your job, you lose your home too. And so we needed a place to be, and we lived in a trailer park because we could afford to buy that out of pocket. And so, that was a continuing lesson of it seems like God keeps pressing me into these places where there are vulnerable people. And that just seems to be where I'm called to minister. It's not an easy place to minister. I mean, it probably would have been easier if I had stayed conservative, if I had stayed white male privileged and just, rested on that. But as I followed Jesus, I just couldn't in good conscience rest on that privileged Christendom. I saw Jesus over and over and over again, preferring the poor, preferring the marginalized. It doesn't help that some of the people who most influenced me, like Oscar Romero and Father Gutierrez, liberation theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was huge. I mean, coming out of Lutheran tradition, his stand on behalf of people right up to his death
Yeah.
And then some more sort of modern people, Benjamin L. Corey and Richard Rohr and Brian Zond and Greg Boyd, Brooksy Cavey. I started reading all of these. Brad Jerzak. I'm still mad at Brad Jerzak for making me cry reading his book. I'm not really. His description of Jesus telling of Lazarus and the rich man just broke my heart and helped me see God in an entirely new way. At a point where I was wrestling with those very specific questions about the accounts in the Bible where it seems like God is cruel. And so because that doesn't jive with the rest of Scripture, how do we interpret that? How do we, what hermeneutic do we apply to that so that it's consistent throughout Scripture?
Mm-hmm. Would you share that? Would you mind sharing that?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, he does it so well, I don't want to take away from it, but it's this idea that the rich man had means and he knew Lazarus's plight. As a matter of fact, he knew Lazarus by name, which is why Lazarus is named in the story. Mm-hmm. And then in Sheol, as they're separated by that gulf, the rich man sees Lazarus and asks, by name, have Lazarus dip his finger to ease my torment. And that sort of clues into the reason why the rich man is in his torment is not because God is punishing him, but because the rich man has not yet gotten to a place where he can see Lazarus as an equal. He still sees Lazarus as a subordinate, as an unworthy person below him. And so when it comes time to go into the feast where we all sit as equals in the family of God, it's not God who is punishing the rich man. It's the rich man who is punishing the rich man by still hanging on to his classist, privileged perspective that some people are less than. He can't sit at the table elbow to elbow with Lazarus if he's going to continue to see Lazarus as someone who serves him. So that just to reframe that story and to see that as just to go along with that idea that hell or torment is really self-imposed by our own selfishness, our own broken perspectives of the world and people around us, and that God's arms are still open wide when we're ready to receive that and to participate in that. Yeah, in a nutshell. But go to Brad's book because he does it so much better.
Yeah, it reminds me of there's a little metaphor story about the person goes to, where is it? The person goes to heaven and people are, happy and full and drinking and eating. And then the person goes to hell and everything's the same except for people are starving and thirsty. Mm-hmm. Because they all have to feed each other with these long spoons or something.
Yes.
Yeah, right. It's just like in heaven, it's just like, okay, here you go. And in hell, it's just like, no.
Was it you and I that were just having that conversation this last week? I literally just had that conversation. Because for me, the parable of the long spoons comes out of Africa. And there's actually a little video on YouTube somewhere. But the picture is all these people sitting around a pit, and in the middle is a pot of soup.
Yes.
And
so how to
and they're trying to they're using these long spoons and they can dip into the pot of soup, but then they start fighting with each other and somebody breaks somebody else's spoon, and it just it's all chaos and selfishness until finally some person realizes they can dip their spoon in the pot and then feed the person across the pit from them, and then they all start doing that. So it falls into this a lot of people have said it. I think Martin Luther King Jr. said it really well, that the interconnectedness of the universe, the interconnectedness of humanity, and that when one of us suffers, we all suffer. And this idea that we have enough if we would all just share with one another. I can't remember right now who said it, but I've heard it. I wonder if it was Bergman. I don't know. I shouldn't say a name because I should look it up first. Who said the poor are not poor because we don't have enough to go around.
Yeah.
Poor are poor because we can't satisfy the rich.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then Gutierrez famous, I love this in your face statement from him. He says, you say you love the poor, name them. That's a punch in the gut. If you can't name poor people, then how can you say you love them, because you're not involved in their lives enough to know what their needs are.
Right.
And then that hurts us all. It's not just the poor that suffer as a result of that, but it's the wealthy as well. Wealthy, privileged, influential, however it is that you have what can be shared. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you've several times you've talked about how Jesus has, I don't know the words, led you, or whatever the words are. And can you tell me what that is like? What is that experientially like?
Well, so obviously the primary source that we have on Jesus' life and teachings is the Gospels and the Bible. And so it's an intentional, serious reading of those, along with some great professors who helped me to learn to sort of set aside the lenses and filters that I bring to reading the Bible, to acknowledge that they're there, but to try and minimize their influence as much as possible. To be with others. Goodness, I think of all places, George Lucas's wife, Melody Hobson, did a TED Talk back in 2014. And she said, I've said it so many times, I probably should be able to quote it pretty well. Invite people into your life who don't look like you, don't sound like you, don't dress like you, and don't see the world the way you do. And you might find that they open your eyes to new perspectives.
Yeah.
And so I began to follow that advice. Like I put it on my phone and I reviewed it regularly. And I really wanted to get outside the bubble. Somehow I had become aware that it would be really easy for me as a white American male to sit in a bubble of privilege and just continue on with my life. But I learned to listen to people. I grew up in Muskegon. And Muskegon is I think that at one point the majority of white people in Muskegon was only 57%. So it's a fairly racially diverse place, and that maybe helped, and my parents too, who taught me to be open to seeing people and welcoming people. And so I intentionally tried to listen to people who didn't see Jesus in the Bible the same way I did. And goodness, I think the best resource for me, or the most influential resource for me, was, I was working as a staff pastor at a kind of a mega church. At least that's the style it was. It was about 500 people. It was close to when I had been a graphic artist. So of course I did the poster designs, and I would do some of the videos, and that was just within my skill set to do. And so I just happenstance came across this group called the Work of the People online. And it's a resource of videos, and they bring together this clearinghouse of writers and theologians and pastors. And so I started to be introduced to people that I never would have encountered otherwise. You know, I'm almost ashamed. I think the list of people I gave you earlier was all white men. But other people,
Well,
like Brenda Salter McNeil and Christina Cleveland, you know, I started to hear voices that were other than what I was familiar with. And the more I engaged that, the more compelling it was. So clearly I had at one point had a very conservative, privileged hermeneutic, interpretive lens when I came to the Bible. But it was just, it has just been a journey of steps. Excuse me. Is that the sign I'm talking too much?
it's your job right now, so you're doing good.
It is, but now I'm a journey of steps where each step opened the door for the next step. And by degrees.
Yeah. Very human.
So this is where you get to do the editing skills.
No editing, just raw.
Goodness, they got
Only humans here.
What am I not supposed to be saying right now?
Well, while I got Brenda Salter McNeil, but what was the other woman?
Christina Cleveland.
Thanks.
She was at Duke until she saw through the veil and realized she was being used.
Mm-hmm.
Token woman, token Black person of color. And so she resigned. And she's done some pretty edgy stuff since. So
Awesome.
you know, for one of the big things that she did for me was, of course, coming out of the Lutheran background, I had a high view of communion, and almost like the way Baptists see baptism, you know. And so I just couldn't stomach messing around with communion. I mean, it was just this rigid thing that you had to adhere to. And then she sort of reframed it for me that the communion table is a table of healing. And so if you can't meet people in their woundedness where they live, then you're not healing anything.
That's great.
You're asking them to get healed and then come to the table, which is not the point at all.
Right.
And so when she gave this talk, and when I encountered it, it was way back during one of these national crises in a police shooting. And she said, for some communities, communion has to look like Arizona iced tea and Skittles while wearing a hoodie, if you're going to be a healing force. So she helped me to see that and reframe that. This is terrible.
Folks, Jason is a human
and
being.
The public speaker who doesn't have a throat lozenge right here in my desk. I know better. Oh, so
yes, I really love that.
It's, you know, it's in the last couple of years, the most ground shaking, paradigm shifting encounter I have had is with John Philip Newell and Celtic Christianity. And I'm a Christian history. I don't know if I dare call myself a scholar, but that was one of the focuses of my studies. And so I know about how Roman Christendom encountered Celtic Christianity at the Synod of Whitby, and how the Roman Church sort of prevailed. And I had my entire semester of Augustine, and I loved Augustine of Hippo. And so I was really all in on that kind of stuff. But I was aware that there had been a conflict. You know, Augustine writes about Pelagius. And then I encounter John Philip Newell and do some other reading and find out that everything that we know about Pelagius was written by Augustine.
Yeah.
Which happens to serve Augustine. And Augustine also did this. So I'm on this journey toward trying to be intentionally nonviolent, as the early Christians were.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing again through new lenses Augustine's use of just war and his sort of sanctioning the emperor to use force, violent military force against the Donatists. And then seeing him through a whole new lens. I love John Philip Newell may be the first person that I heard say that the doctrine of original sin is absurd. And then it didn't exist in the early church. That Augustine introduced the idea, which then went on to become penal substitutionary atonement. And this perception of this, I call it cosmic child abuse, which separates the Father and the Son into having different wills, and makes the Father out to be this violent, bloodthirsty, vengeful, self-absorbed being. And then puts us in this dysfunctional abusee relationship of being constantly loved and despised. And it just didn't make sense. Once I started to read scripture and to listen to people talk about it and to perceive it through another lens, I have been on this journey over the last year of just rejecting everything that has to do with empire, including things like original sin and penal substitutionary atonement, and even creeds, because we've taken this thing that was meant to be a relationship with God, or something that was restorative between humanity and God and amongst humanity, and turned it into a set of beliefs, that propositional beliefs that we have to give assent to. And I never, ever see Jesus doing that. As a matter of fact, Jesus, the only critiques I see Jesus leveling are to the religious people who are doing that kind of thing. The dualistic us and them, pure versus impure. Goodness, the Gospel of Mark and its themes of clean versus unclean, and the Gospel of Luke with its just overt themes of justice. I don't know how I ever missed it before I started to study it. And so this Celtic Christianity that is so close to the earth, Saint Brigid, who became a saint of the church without ever leaving behind the pre-Christian wisdom. And sadly, how the world has been shaped by empire, which reigns by fear and violence and the threat of violence, if you don't toe the line. And then that has become Christianity, where we could have something that is affirming and uplifting and reuniting and restoring and life-giving. So I've been on a journey of sort of rejecting all of that. At my little faith community that we founded, we say, if you're tired of organized religion, that's okay. We practice disorganized religion.
Great.
Yeah, so it's just about living together, and I like to say that we're all just pilgrims walking each other home. I don't think I'm the first. I think I heard that somewhere.
It's Ram Dass.
Yes. Yeah.
You go.
Yeah. and I was at a congregational ministers retreat, where they had the guys who wrote the book, The Gift of Our Wounds. And one of them is Sikh. And so we spent an afternoon basically getting a short and sweet. This is what it means to be a Sikh. This is what the life of a Sikh looks like. This is what Sikhs believe. And at the end, at the book signing, I'm shaking the guy's hand, and I just looked him in the eyes and said, Pardeep, I'm not sure that Jesus wasn't a Sikh. Because everything they describes Jesus. And I love Richard Rohr's idea of the universal Christ. I think it resonated with me when I heard it, as if it was something that I had always known was true. And that's this idea that the Christ is bigger than Jesus, that God, the eternal Son, manifests this idea of the Christ. And wherever you see life, something that's life-giving or love-giving, that is the Christ at work. And this idea of an infinite God. How dare we have the hubris to think that an infinite God could be manifest in one single tribe of human beings?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I have studied other world religions and experienced them firsthand and met people, I'm just compelled by the idea that I can see the manifestation of the Christ in all of these religions. And so how could we think that, one tribe of people is going to somehow correctly represent an infinite God?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not about drawing lines to divide ourselves against other people, but it's about seeing that unity where, I think we need to have the humility to say, well, what can we learn from Sikhs? What can we learn from Buddhists and Hindus and Shintos and Native Americans and
Mm-hmm.
I've even been known to sort of, because you got to find things to give people handholds. And so this is a flawed analogy, admittedly, but I have said to some people trying to express this perspective, I've said, even the Norse mythology, if you look at the North religion, the Scandinavian religion, their chief god is Odin, and they call Odin the Allfather. And as Christians, we pray, I think Catholics call it the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer. We pray to Our Father. I said, linguistically, they're not far off. So is there some kind of, now, as I said, that's flawed, because if we start to see God like Odin, then we fall into civil religion again. But just looking for those unities, because that is, it's not just for the sake of looking for commonality, but it's I think it comes from the desire to find God, to seek and find God, and therefore to be looking for the manifestations of God. And that will come in commonalities, that will come in consistencies. That's why I think life and love are probably the two words that most point us toward the presence and work of God in the world.
I just wonder, what occurs as missing there. I just wonder how you relate to the word truth.
Sure.
Sure, why not? No, it's just interesting. They all to go together for me.
Yeah, and if we're in a postmodern world, I guess. My philosophy capstone was that one of the books was Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, and this idea of that if you don't hang on to truth, that your mind becomes so open that it falls out, or whatever. I don't know if that's the direction that you're going with the question, but there then does become the question of what is truth. And I actually just recently had to have a sit down with another local pastor, Pastor Betsy Campikes, who is the ELCA pastor here in town. And she's been a wonderful mentor to me over the last few years. And I just sat down and I'm like, I'm really struggling because I read things in the Bible. So we restarted this journey through the Old Testament. And I'm reading this stuff in the Bible. It's clearly written in English. We know that it's nuanced in every time you translate it. So, and there's decisions that are made. And so you have to be careful there. But just seeing the activities of God that are more commonly pointed to the wrathful, vengeful, how can God choose this liar, this thief, this usurper, this murderer, this, David and his having a heart of God, and yet he essentially rapes this woman while her husband's off to war, and then gets her pregnant and then murders her husband. Or arranges to have her husband murdered in order to cover it up, and then he's the guy so then what is truth? What is true? How do you find that? If you start pulling up I think we like to think of truth as anchors. And I remember my first semester studying for my ordination, and I felt like, so the metaphor I came up with was, I was coming out of the Lutheran Missouri Synod Church, where I likened my faith to a zeppelin that was firmly anchored to the ground. And I felt like my professors were going around the zeppelin one by one, yanking out the anchors. And I was panicking. And it was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's gonna get away. And then, just like the last anchor comes loose and the zeppelin just kind of gently floats up into the air. And it was like, oh, that's what zeppelins are for.
That's so great.
And just, that's what it felt like to me in that moment. And it was the only way I could describe it to people. So yeah, there's truth. And I think Empire wants to enforce a truth that maybe is more expansive than what truth really is. I think my biggest beef with what I would probably call post-Enlightenment modernists, which then spills into American evangelicalism, is not that they hold some truth, because I affirm that they do. The problem is, I think that they believe that they have the market on all truth. And so postmodernism would say we all have a seat at the table. And it would allow for fundamentalists, evangelical modernists to have a seat at the table. The problem is they keep trying to take over the whole table and say that nobody else can have a seat at the table or a say in conversation.
Right.
And so seeking truth, it does get difficult and it does get scary. But it's not as though we're without any kind of anchors. That's why I keep pointing to, is it loving and is it life-giving? And those two things seem to be universal ideals throughout humanity and in all Christian religions. Oh goodness, this year during Ramadan, I'd committed myself to actually sitting down and reading the Quran, and I wanted to read through the Quran during the month of Ramadan, just out of solidarity, out of seeking truth and understanding. And my mind was blown at how much and how favorably they speak of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have to finish it. I tried. I didn't finish it, but it's still I'm still chipping away at it here and there. But the one thing I felt like in that journey was I felt like I wish I could reach out to an imam or a Quran scholar, because as I started to engage it, these questions started to pile up. And they weren't bad questions. They were just like, okay, this is not my book. I need someone to help me understand what's being written here. So I've done that with a number of different things, just as I had my hermeneutics professor. I asked him if I could do an independent study on preaching. And I said I could lean back on my laurels and learn what it means to be a white Anglo-American Wesleyan preacher. That would be easy. I said,
Right.
but I want to learn, what does it mean to be a Hispanic liberation preacher, or a feminist preacher, or a Black American preacher, and he just leaned back in his chair and smiled at me, and he said, "You want to look behind the curtain, don't you?" And I was like, yes, that is the best way I've ever heard it put. You're right, I do. Because I believe that the core tenets of our faith have to be good and useful everywhere. And if they are not, then they are not core tenets of our faith.
Mm-hmm.
They might be doctrines of a denomination, or they might be cultural things. And there's nothing saying that has to be bad. Of course, we are a diversity. It's not about washing away all of the diversity. It's about celebrating the diversity. But it's also about keeping a perspective on if God is the God of all of us, and if salvation is for all of us, then the truth is going to manifest around the world and throughout history. And anything that we encounter that is specific to a place or a time or a people, it can be good, but it isn't necessarily part of the universal core truth of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I think there's a book, Helping Without Hurting. I encountered a story about missionaries going to Africa, and they were preaching the Bible, and they were doing what they thought was right. And they preached this part where a man had to be the husband of one wife. And then they moved on to the next village. Well, someone had to rush from the previous village to where they were being missionaries further down the road. And they said, you have to come back. You've just thrown this village into disarray. All of the men in this village divorced all of their wives except for one. And now we have all of these women who are now widows and orphans, and all these kids who are now orphans, and they have no way, because of the way that their society was structured, they had no way to support themselves. They had just the church, like these missionaries, had now pushed a whole bunch of people out into the margins, vulnerable margins.
Right.
And they had to come back, and they had to abandon the idea. So this idea of husband of one wife.
Well, and I just want to interject and say,
Yeah.
I think the scripture says to be in leadership. Not all the people, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and it may be.
And then the cultural overlay came all the men, but I believe it actually says to be in leadership. But go ahead.
Kind of like the Bible says, don't be drunk, and then we do this cultural overlay.
Right. Let's not drink at all.
Well, you can't drink at all. Yeah. That's the West Side fighting with the Lutheran and me.
Yeah. Right. And then, the whole putting a fence around the law was what Jesus was constantly pushing against.
Yeah.
He was constantly pushing against the fences around the law. So it's just we humans, that's what we do.
Yeah, it is.
So sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to bring
good.
that in because it's a very important point, I think.
It is. And we do add on to it, don't we? I mean, Jesus never once affirmed the verbal Torah, the oral Torah. He lived according to the written Torah, but all of this stuff that was added on, like this, I just recently did a sermon on the Pharisees were angry with Jesus because his disciples didn't wash their hands. And everybody seems to take that as, hygiene. No, it wasn't a hygiene thing at all. It wasn't about whether they washed their hands.
They didn't know about germs.
It was whether they knew the secret handshake of this religious organization that did this very ritualized. And I even found there are still Jews that practice this today. And so I was able to find a video online of a rabbi teaching how to do this ritual hand washing.
Oh, cool.
And I said, see, this is what Jesus and the Pharisees were talking about at that point. You know, like one he even said at one point, when you wash your hands, you have to hold your hands up because you only wash to the wrists, and you never put your hands back down again, because any water that has dripped down from your hand to your arm, if you put your hand back, is now unclean water and it comes back onto your hands. So it was this, you know, we add on culturally, we add on, and we put fences around the law, because it's about control.
Yeah.
I think the opposite of faith is control, and we want to be in control and we want to have everything nailed down. I think because we want to get on with our lives. We just want to trust that everything's in place. You know, don't move the thing in the sanctuary because that's where it's supposed to be 50 years ago. And we don't want to exercise the thought energy or exert the time to question, is that still the way we should do it, or was that just an artifact of a time and a place and a people?
Yeah, I think we make idols of it all.
We do. We even make idols of the Bible. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are biblical that are not Christ-like.
Yes. So is it okay if I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I am amazed at how you're willing step by step, how malleable you are willing to be around what I would see as the leading of the Holy Spirit, for you to step by step go into what God has for you around the Bible and tradition and scripture and all that stuff. What do you notice about this? Why are you so malleable? What has made you willing to say yes to journey outside the gate?
Yeah, I think it might be a couple of things that play into it. One is my life, I guess previous life. I really need to get back to making art again. But as an artist, you can't be a good artist without being an observer. And if you only ever create art in the set way in which you perceive things, your art will be stagnant. I won't speak to anyone but you or people like you. So as an artist, visual artist, theater artist, and now as I guess you could say my wordsmithing, my writing, my preaching is my art form. I have to be willing to see it through somebody else's eyes. And so that puts me in a position of wanting to be malleable. The other I would say is I'm just immensely, profoundly grateful to my professors who taught me, who very well knew that their job was not to teach me what to think, but to teach me how to think, and who taught me to be a lifelong learner. I think maybe it helps that I finished my studies in my 40s rather than finishing in my 20s, that I had some better perspectives on things, but I really have, for some, I don't even know how to say why, I just have embraced the idea of being a lifelong learner. And just willing to say it's not all about me. It's not all about the way I see things. It's not all about protecting my culture. And I remember there was a point at which I realized that the implications of this, and I had a classmate named Kenny, came out of Grand Rapids and helped found a hip hop church down in Grand Rapids. And and I looked at Kenny and I said, if I start to do this, they're going to see me as a Benedict Arnold, and I'm going to be rejected for betraying my gender and betraying my race and betraying my culture. And that has been true to different degrees. There has been a cost to it. We had to live in a trailer park. I have to be careful how I say that.
Yeah.
Um, but we had to move a lot, and my kids had to have their education interrupted multiple times, and as a result of me being willing to see from other people's points of view, and then not willing to shut up. I don't play ball. I can't. I don't. I just can't. It's the times that I have tried have been living hell.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about this idea of just speaking what's on your mind and in cruelty and not caring about how it affects other people. That's not what it's about at all. As a matter of fact, I attribute Bonhoeffer for helping me wrestle with that idea. Because one of the things I learned from Bonhoeffer is a pastor's job is not to complain about his congregation, and that our job as Christians is not necessarily to stand up for our own rights. We're not. So this is what I think Bonhoeffer would say. We're not called to stand up for our own rights. We are, however, called to stand up for the rights of others. And I think that requires some of that trust of the parable of the long spoons. So it's not just about feeding and being fed, but it's also about our reputations.
Yeah.
About finding truth together. I do think community is really important as far as that whole seeking of truth. I mean, heretics and hurtful people have often they come out as a result of getting away from the community, coming up with ideas that don't jive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If I lose my train of thought, I guess I just have to hope that I answered the question.
Yeah, great. I really, really like how you answered the question. And something that jumps from here is, it seems to me, some people who go to seminary, depends on the seminary usually.
Mm-hmm.
Some seminaries cause more opening and some cause more
Yes.
learning the answers, it seems to me.
Yes.
So regardless, people go and learn stuff. And it seems like a percentage of those people start to think differently, understand differently than the congregations, than the regular, everyday people, and then continue to have people stay in their usual consciousness and their usual understanding. Mm-hmm. And then some, like I'm hearing you say, are saying, all right, I discovered this. Let's talk about this. Is that what you do?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm wondering about this. Let's pray on this. Like, I'm assuming you're helping others to broaden their minds and find Jesus anew.
Yeah, I think that my sweet spot in ministry, and perhaps the area which gives me the most joy and the most fruit, is teaching. So I have to be careful not to slip too much into teaching in the pulpit, because teaching and preaching are not the same thing. But it does help me to see things in a different way, to verbalize things in a new way. One of the things that I love to hear, that I get to hear a lot, is people say, well, you put that in a way that I never heard before. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times I'm only able to put it that way because I've listened to somebody that nobody else is listening to.
Yes.
And they had the idea. Or I've learned to accept the fact that, okay, maybe I'm not all that. I'm not a Brian Zond. I'm not a Walter Brueggemann, but I am uniquely me in this place and this time, and mm-hmm. I am the web of relationships mm-hmm. of people that I'm learning from. So there is nobody in this community that is learning from the same people that I'm learning from. Mm-hmm. So it becomes kind of a dialectical thing, this conversation of the conversations that I'm having that then shape the conversations I have with other people.
Yes.
and just admitting that, there have been times when I'm like, God, why am I in this very rural, it voted 85%, one party in the last presidential election, and is probably 97% Caucasian, and very rural. Why, when I have a heart for interracial reconciliation and intersectional work and being overtly affirming, why am I here? And I ask that question quite often. Like, why can't I be somewhere? Earlier I said, as I was reading the Quran, I was like, I need someone to help me understand this. And that's right from the Bible too. How am I supposed to understand this if somebody won't tell me? Right. And so why am I here in this place at this time doing this? And I guess the answer I keep hearing is because maybe if it weren't for me, these people would never hear some of these terms or ideas. And so, I have in the past called myself the Rocky Balboa of ministry, because I don't know how to protect my face for nothing. But I'm going all 15 rounds. I mean, you knock me down, I'm back up again. I don't know how to quit. I think my kids would prefer if I knew how to quit sometimes, but but I mean, yeah, that's just what I do. And I can't help but do that because as I get older, I learn to just be true to who I am.
Right. And actually, there aren't that many, there's nothing new under the sun. There aren't that many new ideas. And, I'm a really big fan of the first follower. I'm really a big, like none of these people would make any difference if other people like you aren't sharing their ideas or saying, hey, you might want to read at this book or look at this video. No one would know. So that's a huge thing, I think. It matters to bring that to our neighbors.
Yeah, and one way to see that this all kind of coalescing in a practical experience prior to COVID, I said that we were doing this weekly meal for, we're just providing this meal for free. We're like, here, come and eat, because that's what Jesus would do. And eventually we found out that other churches were doing the same thing. So there were first followers in other churches who were malleable to the leading of the Holy Spirit, who were doing the same thing. So, Tuesdays it was lunch and supper at the Episcopal Church, and Wednesdays it was supper at the Congregational Church, and Mondays and Thursdays it was supper at the Catholic Church. So we had all, without intent, almost gotten to the point where in our community there was a free meal for anybody every night of the week. We came this close. Of course, nobody wants to do Friday, Saturday, Sunday, so that was the difficult part. But then, we at the table, we came along, we started to do it on Sunday. So that makes, when we became the table, the other church ceased. When I was not there anymore, they ceased doing their free meal entirely. We got to be at odds because literally, I quote, they did not like that ministry. Some of the leaders in that place didn't like that ministry because I was bringing in drunks, junkies, and freeloaders. I was like, have you ever read anything about what Jesus did?
There's this thing called the Bible. Maybe you want to maybe you'd want to read it.
So, we had this community of people who then came together and started to realize there's a thing happening. the Spirit of God is working on the mission of God in this community, and people, we had an exorbitant number of homeless people, and we were feeding people.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that feeding was a community was forming.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a group of people who would go to each of the churches each night. And then some of the people were saying, well, they're just freeloading and taking advantage of the system. Look at them going from church to church getting a free meal. Like, if you were hungry, wouldn't you go eat? And what do you think is the purpose of these meals? And I think maybe you're just upset because they've formed a community that you can't control. They formed a church, and that church moved from church to church to church, or a congregation, and it moved from church to church to church.
Yeah.
But it wasn't beholden to any to membership rules or discipline, or the only thing that bound them together was that they were hungry, and that as they ate together, they got to know each other, and as they got to know each other, they loved each other. And
it's magic.
I don't.
Yeah. It's a human paradigm. That's what we do. And so that's part of the beauty of eating together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Which is why we called our church the table.
It's really great.
And why we use dinner church as our model, because human beings gather together at the table in a way that it's just different from every other way. I mean, Jesus, the Lord's Supper is at the table. Jesus was revealed to the disciples on the road to Emmaus when he broke bread with them. It's Abraham and the strangers, let me provide you with some food. It's all throughout Scripture, sitting down at the table together.
Yes.
And history too. I mean, history bears this out. How often are alliances forged and over a meal together?
And the New Testament church, seems to me, it was about a meal, not just not just the Eucharist or whatever.
Yep.
So
yep, absolutely.
Beautiful. Could I change direction a little bit?
Absolutely.
In service of time, I would really like to hear your Damascus Road experience, and like what it seems to me like there's this another paradigm that showed up of like you called upon Jesus and Jesus was there, I assume. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah. So during high school, my family and younger, my family had kind of fallen in love with camping as a family. And so on the weekends we'd take off. And so that interrupted any kind of church involvement. And so, logistically I fell away from the church, but also the satanic panic of the 80s. I really got the message that they didn't want people like me there, which then pours into my unique calling and ministry, which I feel like is to the people who've been told by the church, there's no place for you.
Yeah.
And here I am to say, oh, yes, there is. And so I fell away from the church. And to give you an illustration of how far away from faith I moved, I was in Desert Storm, and I drove my Humvee through a minefield at night in the dark and survived. We had fallen behind the convoy that we were protecting, got to the camp late at night. And then the next morning, as they were repairing, because our Humvee had problems, and as they're repairing the Humvee, they're like, oh, well, what direction did you come in from? And I said, well, that direction. And they said, no, you didn't. I mean, what do you mean, no, I didn't? That's the direction we came in from. They said, no, that's a minefield. You didn't come in that way. And I said, yes, I did. Look, there's tracks. There's one set of tracks. And most people don't know, but minefields are designed to kill people who go straight through them. And we drove straight through it. And the mechanic grabbed some binoculars and said, well, look at your tracks. And sure enough, there's these little prongs sticking up out of the dirt, like really close to our tracks. And I did that in the army during war while I was wearing dog tags that said no preference for my religion because I had rejected God. So,
what did you think and feel about it at the time when you found out that miracle happened?
well, I certainly didn't attribute it to God at the time. No way.
Yeah.
I mean, it was luck.
Right.
It was just stupid, dumb luck. Unbelievable luck, though.
Right.
And it wasn't until years later that I understood it as a miracle.
Yeah.
So fast forward several years, I got married. I already told you I didn't want to get married in a church, but because my wife did want to, I acquiesced. But we were able to write our own ceremony, and I included, there was an Apache prayer that I included because I'd had some experience with Native American faith. Then comes the birth of our second child, my first son, August 30th, 2003. And he was born with a hole in each of his lungs, leaking air into his chest cavity, which would have collapsed his lungs. And he was in distress immediately. I don't know how this happened. I think in conversations with the doctor, I had told them that I was an MP in the Army, and I think maybe they heard that I was an EMT in the Army, because they never let parents in the room for this kind of stuff. But my son Thomas had to have a chest tube put in to drain that air out of his chest cavity, and I held his legs while that happened. There's no way that ever happens.
Right.
My son's, no, I'm not going to say names because I don't want to get doctor in trouble. Anyway, the doctor had the same name as my son, and so that was a point of connection. And then I was just by his bedside, all the way into neonatal ICU, and it wasn't until hours later that my wife got all fixed up and came down to the ICU, and my face was just blanched white, and she's like, "What's going on?" They had not told her anything about what had happened. And so I filled her in, and they were not going to pry me away from that little bed of his. Well, except that biology took over and I really had to go to the bathroom. So they were able, I did concede to step away, and we went up to my wife's hospital room. And he had been born so late that our parents had left and gone home. And so I called my mom to announce to her his birth. And I got about a sentence in and I just cracked and I couldn't speak anymore. So I handed the phone to my wife, retreated into the bathroom in her hospital room. And my knees hit that tile floor at the side of the tub. And now what I'm about to tell you, if you had told me that a week before, I would have said, you need medication and you need to be committed. My knees hit that tile floor and I knelt over the side of the bathtub, and suddenly the bathtub was no longer a bathtub. It was a rock. And I was in an outdoor space and there was a blindingly bright light. All I was really aware of were feet of the person in front of me, and I couldn't look up because of the brightness of the light. But it was not a stark, scary situation at all. There was nothing but comfort and peace. And I just opened up. And it was very, this is why I call it a Damascus Road moment, because I read the writing of Paul saying, Lord, Lord. And he had never encountered Jesus in person, but he knew who was in front of him. And I had that same feeling, right? I never encountered Jesus in person, but I knew who was standing in front of me. And there was a conversation, and I essentially got the impression that kind of I'd had enough rope to wander, that God had been sort of there with me all along, and just letting me live as I chose to live. But I was coming back now, and I was pleading for my son's life. And I don't want to say this in a way that sounds like I sort of made a contract. I think covenant is a much better word. But even still, it wasn't like I had made a bargain with God, but God told me that my son would be fine. And then I swore to dedicate the rest of my life to serving. And so it was my call back to faith, and it was my call into ministry, even though I had no idea what that meant or would look like. And I came out of that bathroom thinking I'd been in there for probably about 5 minutes. My wife insists that it was, and I looked at the clock too, and she's right. I had been in there for 45 minutes. So there was this odd passage of time, or not passage of time. There was this encounter with the divine. There was this overwhelming peace and assurance. And I just said to her, literally, I think these were my words, I have it on good authority that he's going to be just fine. And so that there have been days when life has gotten so dark that the truth of that calling is the only thing that's kept me alive.
Yeah.
And there have been days in ministry when the truth of that is the only thing that keeps one foot in front of the other. So I guess, there's a lot of people who might say, oh, I wish I had an experience like that. And then I would respond and say, no, you probably don't. Because I think only people who are asked to go through dark valleys are given. And I can't say, universally, but I think that when you do receive a gift like that, often it is to sustain you through a dark valley. And we've been through some, for sure. So that's my Damascus Road encounter with God, and it has sustained me to this day. And I have had my arguments with God. I have paced a groove in the carpet in the chancel and screamed my throat hoarse at God. And yet there's something so deep in me that just knows. And nobody argued me into that relationship. There was no propositional truths. It was a person in desperate need and despair, and a God that was nothing but my love and grace. At that point, God had no reason whatsoever to sustain me or even respond to me. Why? I had overtly disinvited God from my life. And yet, the second I turned around, there were open arms. So, how could I ever play gatekeeper to anybody else? I can't. It would be untrue to my own experience.
Yes. That's beautiful.
No, I'm a
Thank
weirdo.
you. Thank you. It's so beautiful. It's so inspiring. And, I want to tie that to why are you so malleable? And it seems to me some of that at least has to come back to there.
Yep.
Like, in your soul what's real.
Yeah, and maybe there's something to be said, so I studying, my wife is an early child care professional. She's a child care center director. And I've had some of that training, my family systems training, and, learning Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the ways that human beings learn. So I know that one of the things with kids is their family provides an anchor for them. If their family provides an anchor point for them, they are more likely to explore. And so maybe the firmness of that one anchor for me allows me to question everything else. And be questioned. So this malleableness doesn't mean that I'm always questioning everybody else, but I always say to my people and everybody, if you catch me in something, call me on it. If I say something that's weird or confusing, ask me about it. By questioning my own beliefs is how I've gotten where I'm at. So the only authority I acknowledge is Christ, and the only anchor that I need is Christ. And so that allows me to, now that sounds super courageous. And there are times when I just want to curl up in a ball and same, please make it easy. But you know what? You know, like I said, Rocky Balboa ministry, you're crumpled up in the corner of the ring and Mickey cuts your eye open so you can see for another round and you just get up and go again.
Yes. Yes.
Because there's too many people who can't. And there's too many people who have been told by the church that there's no place for them, that they are an abomination, that they are not worthy. And I can't quit going until I know that they all have heard from Jesus, I love you, and there's a place for you. Yeah. It's kind of what motivates me, what keeps me going, what helps keep me malleable. Constantly looking behind the curtain. I mean, if you're a pastor of a church today and you are not looking behind the curtain and listening to voices outside your own, you're just closing your church. We can no longer afford to believe that that there's an attraction to the church, that people are automatically going to come. They're not. It's said in overwhelming numbers, I'm done with you. And it's our fault. We need to listen and we need to respond and we need to be willing to. So this word deconstruction is a huge word, and it's both a thing that I love. As a Gen Xer, I claim I'm a deconstructionist. I'm a skeptic and I'm a questioner. One of my favorite t-shirts says, unquestioned answers are more dangerous than unanswered questions. And so I own that whole deconstruction thing, but it baffles me a little bit because it sounds like when some people talk about deconstruction, they talk about destruction. So the analogy that I sort of come up with is, for me, deconstruction is like one of those renovation shows where they find this old house and they start to tear down all of the stuff that's been built onto it over the years, and they take it down to the studs, and then they shore up anything that's weak and find where it's strong, and then they rebuild on that. So to me, that's deconstruction. It's demo day in a restoration process. Some people, I think, perceive deconstruction as simply coming in and demolishing the home. And maybe not even building another home, just putting in a vacant lot or a park or a garden or something. And this, I've had conversations like this. I had a boomer professor. This was part of our conversation about how generations respond and what generations are doing in the church. And we were talking about how boomers were really good at building institutions, and Gen Xers are really good at coming behind and tearing those institutions down. and I asked him, I'm like, well, how can we positively, because when you're in the deconstruction business, you can easily go too far, and it just becomes the destruction for the point of destruction. I said, so how can we effectively and beneficially deconstruct and tear down what's extra, and get back to the core? And he looked at me and he said, you can't ask me that question. He said, I'm a boomer. I helped to build these institutions. I can't tell you how to tear them down. You're going to have to ask somebody else. And so I think that's why I love millennials and Gen Z and Gen Y so much, because there's a hopefulness, and I see them wanting to rebuild on what we have deconstructed. But I have to do some of that reconstruction work too. I mean, the world won't wait for you to deconstruct and then just sit there in a pile of rubble. There's too much of that already. We need hope, and we need life and love and community and connection. And those are all, I think that's all core to our faith. It's not about arguing over whether the Spirit came by way of the Son and the Father, or just by way of the Father. You know,
Right.
Let's go back to the original division over the filioque. You know, I don't think that's the point. That doesn't mean I don't study that, because I think that good theology has profound implications for how we worship and the relationship we see that we have with God and with each other. I mean, because of the implications, that's why theology is important. And I would never stop studying it. And I love studying it. Especially now I've got a whole new world of theology to study with Celtic Christianity and other religions. And but I think it's all about the relationship, as cliche as that sounds. We are a social species.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the strongest punishments we can impose when somebody is incarcerated is solitary confinement. And the stuff that we've learned in psychology that solitary isolation does to people. We just went through a 1.5 year experiment on what isolation does to people because of COVID. The gospel is about restoration and relationship and life. Not about whether you say the right creed or believe the right words and so that's been my move as I've been malleable, as I've been following God. It's just looking at where God is at work. And I don't think I've ever seen God overtly at work amongst a group of people arguing over some academic point. Not to say that I don't think those are important, because I do. And those academic studies and questions are what led me in part to the free community meal. But the free community meal is where I saw God at work.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Beautiful. Are you okay going a little longer, or do you want to?
I'm okay. I can go on maybe not more than another half hour. Then I got to think about where I need to be.
Awesome. So. I'd really love to hear. You know, you've been in ministry. I'd really love to hear about your preparation for ministry and your continual preparation for ministry. These are 2 questions, really. And then also how ministry itself has changed you, has helped you deepen and grow, has helped changed your understanding of people and God. So those are that's 2 whole questions there that you could answer in days, but give me 5 minutes on each or something.
I don't think that there is. I have to acknowledge the value of elementary school 5 days a week Bible class.
Really?
I did not stay in that tradition, and there's a lot of things in that tradition that I no longer believe. But as a child, I was prepared with a familiarity with the Bible that has served me very well.
Wow.
Yeah, even studying with other people who are studying to be pastors, who didn't have that. Now, sometimes I think in faith tribes where Sunday school is still prevalent, if there's still some dedication toward familiarity with the Bible stories, I think it's helpful. But I don't know how you match 5 days a week for an hour. It's 5 hours.
For an hour.
Yeah. Yeah, from 3rd through 8th grade. So what, 6
Wow.
years?
If that's done
6 years.
intelligently, that's a lot.
Yeah. And so that was sort of the bedrock on which, even though I walked away from the faith, when I came back, I hadn't lost that. I hadn't lost any of that.
Yeah.
So I started, because I was already in the work world, and I just started in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They have a deacon program. And my first pastor mentor had come through that program to be ordained. So that's where I started. And I would go to these seminars, like all day on a Saturday. And then there would be homework that you would do. And then you would apply that stuff in the ministry setting where you were working. So it began as a lay ministry training. And then I got to be the ministry assistant at a church plant. I was worshiping in a high school cafeteria every week. So there's few things that can compare with the passion and camaraderie that goes with a church plant when people have to set up and tear down every week. That's just a powerful, practical experience in ministry. Then I had to do some of my own study as we transitioned from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod to the Wesleyan Church. And I had to answer some questions, which required some of my own personal study. So I just, there's that being malleable and learning. If I was going to make the transition into the Wesleyan Church, it had, I had questions first. And so I did all that. And then, like I said, in 2010, so we sort of followed the bubble a little bit when the bubble burst in real estate. And again, it was God pulling up anchors. So everything that anchored us to our lives in Michigan got pulled up, and we were able to have a courageous move. So that's another spiritual experience that we have. My wife and I drove down to Indiana Wesleyan in Marion, Indiana, to consider whether I should go down there to school. And it was a bright, hot Indiana summer day in August, end of July, early August. And while I was in the academic advisor's office in the School of Theology and Ministry, the heavens just opened up and rain just started pouring down. And we got done with our appointment with him, and we went out to the doors to leave the building, and it was going to be just this drenched run across the campus to the next appointment. But right next door was where the little prayer chapel was. And so my wife, Megan, and I ducked in there. And because we were wrestling over this, there was a school that I could have gone to that was a lot closer to home in Grand Rapids. And we had felt like God had said, if that's how big your faith is, I'll honor that. And so we're in this prayer chapel, like really wrestling with, do we give up all of our support network to go follow this leading? And we prayed in there for about 5 minutes, and we came back. We opened the doors to the prayer chapel to step out again. and the sky was blue. There was not a cloud in the sky, and the grass was still wet, but the sidewalks were completely dry. I know. And this time it wasn't just me, it was my wife too. And we looked at each other, and literally at the same time, both of us said to each other, can we ignore that? So that was sort of how we got the nod that we would be cared for and blessed, if you want to use that word. It's hard to use that word when you realize so many people struggle in ways that are more courageous than we are, and still don't get that quote unquote blessing. And so I went down there for school for 3 years. I didn't have a job for 3 years. We had a roof over our head. The way that house came to us seemed to be the movement of God. The fact that the Michigan state government paid me unemployment for the first 2 years that I was down there, even though I was normally you enroll in school and you're not available for work anymore. But because of the No Worker Left Behind program at the time, they allowed me to go to a school out of state, and they allowed me to train to be clergy.
It's amazing.
It is. So I studied down there. I decided to not go on to seminary in that moment. In part, I will say, because I was a little bit academically exhausted. I knew I needed to process. I think that the training I got there was as rigorous as any seminary. And so I knew that I needed to go into frontline ministry work so that when I did go to seminary, I would have better questions to ask. That was my intentional point in doing that. So ministered back up in Michigan for a little while, and then sort of, pastors lose jobs. And so I started to go back to Wesley Seminary, which is right there on the campus of Indiana Wesleyan. I began that process. It didn't. It's a good place, and it's a very practical seminary. I didn't want my education to be entirely inbred. That's a terrible way to say that. I didn't want it to only be in one box or one framework. And I guess thankfully for me, being later in life, now the more I do ministry, the more I realize many ministers come into ministry later in life. So I'm not as unique as I thought I was at the time. But coming in later in life, the Wesleyan Church had a set of requirements that didn't necessarily mean a seminary degree. So I met all of those requirements for ordination. So I was able to get ordained in 2014. And I was just going to go on to seminary because I'm a lifelong learner and I wanted to be better at what I do. But it just didn't fit. Circumstantially, it didn't fit with what was going on in our lives at the time. And I just wasn't passionate about this was the place I needed to be. So all of my study since then has been as a result of sort of migrating from the Wesleyan Church to the Congregational Church. So I did a lot of congregational studies as requirements for moving from that transition. And then my own, I guess I don't write papers, but I write sermons every week and do presentations
on Facebook.
So I don't have a seminary. I don't have an MDiv, but I'm starting to get the feeling. I think that I'm to the point where I kind of would like to. And I think CTS, Chicago Theological Seminary, is a place I would really like to go. I considered Fuller out in California for a while. I'm a Midwest boy though, and I love Chicago, and my dream has always, back when I was an artist, my dream was to attend Chicago Institute of Art. and get my degree in art from there. So it seems kind of full circle to go to Chicago. Plus, it's a super progressive seminary with lots of interfaith stuff. And I follow them, and I sort of absorb everything I can from them.
Neat. And the deep question around this one is, do you feel like you got what the training and practice you need to care for people in their spiritual lives?
I do believe that I have. I will say that I have since questioned, because of some of the directions the Wesleyan Church has gone and some of the practices that they practice, that I think some of that might be as a result of a clergy that is not as educated as it could be. I'm really hesitant to level that critique, though.
Yeah, it's okay.
And I certainly feel like I could benefit from more. But as a general practitioner who ministers, I find myself teaching other ministers things constantly. So I have never felt like, short of the paper that says MDiv on it, I have never felt like I've ever been the littlest person in the room. You know, and in part, that's, I think, maybe the benefit of being malleable. And so when I do see a weakness, I attack it with study. And so that's part of why I'm feeling like maybe I would like to go to seminary. Although I do still have some thoughts about that tied to my resistance of empire.
Yeah.
Because there are some questions I would like to continue to ask, and there are some areas that I would like to continue to study. It doesn't have to be in a seminary setting, but certainly there is something about being in an academic environment like that that sort of supercharges or turbocharges that process. But yeah, so this last year I have, as I have sort of discovered Celtic Christianity and Pelagius, and I have gotten to a point where I have come to find peace with being considered a heretic by a prominent section of the Christian church. And I'm okay with that.
It's a big step. It's a hard step.
Yeah.
It
well,
is.
in part, I don't know who said this, but I came across, and it was just a stupid meme, but it struck me in a profound place that said, don't receive criticism from someone you wouldn't seek advice. So I began for me, that was framed in this idea that why would I be concerned about what fundamentalist evangelicals think and Christian nationalists think about what I believe and teach, when I would never go and ask them for advice on my ministry or my beliefs. So why should I stay up at night worrying about what they think about me?
Yeah.
Now that's why I sort of have connected with some other pastors and said, oh, you got it, because now I'm looking at the Bible and, you know, and what I'm reading about God there, and that's where I am concerned about. You can't just go off on your own. Community is important, and you know, I think I learned to critique John Calvin because when he wrote his Institutes, he got off by himself in isolation, and only later added on, you know, early church doctors and stuff. So he kind of wrote that in isolation from the community. Calvin and Baptists are my whipping boys. I love them, but you know, maybe I picked that up in the Army, right? You know, in the Army, you make fun of Marines and airmen and sailors, and they make fun of you.
Right.
But when the dice are down, you've got each other's backs, you know. So
Yeah. 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 And so what have you learned in actual practical ministry and practice?
that they need to teach some different stuff in seminary.
Like what?
Nonprofit management and
Yes.
conflict resolution should both
Yes.
be prominent courses in seminaries.
Yes.
If you are
Now,
going to go in pastoral ministry, you better learn nonprofit management and conflict resolution.
yes. Anything.
And a
That's
minor in
awesome.
psych wouldn't hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we major in the theology and the doctrine and the ritual and the worship. That's all stuff that we need to learn because nobody else will learn it.
Right.
But as the leader of a church, probably one of the most difficult things that I have had to learn is nonprofit management, because my executive skills are crap. And conflict resolution. And so I've tried to seek some of that training on my own, trying to learn nonviolent language, trying to, get it in family systems training, and
Mhm.
and the acknowledgement that I am a general practitioner. When it comes to counseling, I am a general practitioner, and the most important thing I can do is be the convenient contact point, the friendly contact point that can funnel somebody into the help that they need in that regard. So I think a lot of pastors and churches have done damage to people trying to be experts on counseling when they shouldn't try to be.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's one of the other things, I haven't mentioned it, but one of the other things that I do, and it's really hard to do, but I keep plugged into social media, and I plug into places that are full of people who've ejected out of the church, who've been hurt by the church, who
Mhm.
considered heretics. I watch movies by atheist directors about the church. Years ago, I think the church was up in an uproar over the Noah movie. But I went to watch it because it was directed by an atheist, and I'm like, we need to be open to what, this is art, this is communicating to us, we need to know what they're saying.
Yeah.
There was a Netflix series recently called Messiah, that was basically a what if the Messiah came back today, how would we respond and what would it look like? And I just thought it was amazingly profound. I wish they would make another season of it, but I can understand why. I think they're probably not. It touches a little close to home.
Mhm.
And for Christians who are not comfortable with the idea, so another thing that I was surprised from the Quran is the respect that Islam gives for Jew and Christian as the people of the book, actually preferential treatment for all of the people of the book. And I don't think right now Christianity in America is comfortable with the idea that we would have any kind of friendliness with our Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters, human beings.
Mhm.
And so I can see where that wouldn't. But when I sit there and I read, there's a poet named Emily Joy, who's a huge critic of the church. Emily Joy Poetry, and some of her stuff is really hard for me to read because it's painful. And there's when I spend time listening, there's a Facebook group called Your Favorite Heretics. And I just listen to the voices of people who have been hurt, and I take them at face value and respect what they say, whether I agree with it or not. Because I think that's the only way we're going to move forward. We can't stay within our little protective bubbles and only hear what's comfortable for us to hear.
Mhm.
Yeah. all ways
you.
that I continue to try and push and educate myself. I will say that my wife having a professional career and salary, and the fact that we're in a place where I was freed up to found a church that, frankly, financially, I could walk away from at any moment. That, I mean, we'd have to tighten the belt a little bit, but that frees me up, one, to say what I need to say, but two, to study where I need to study. And so I kind of follow the curriculum of life as it is lived in this community amongst the people that I'm amongst right now. They are my professors in my curriculum. And if at some point in the future I want to hear those beautiful words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," I better pay attention to my professors in curriculum. Yeah. Sounds pretty when I put words to it like that.
Isn't it nice? It's probably not as organized and beautiful in reality.
In reality, yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I don't want to impinge so much on your time. I want to stop before you said you had to stop.
Yeah.
But you've been so generous, Jason. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's really a lot of wisdom, a lot of insight. I'm very grateful to see a little better life from your perspective and walk with God and serving people from your perspective. It's inspiring for me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And this has been good for me too. I'm grateful. It's, this is, like I said, it gives you a chance to put to words sometimes things that you just been kind of maybe chewing on and just waiting for the right person to ask the right question at the right time.
Yes.
Say, oh yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, that's how this ties to that.
Yeah.
Look at
Next time, put a lozenge in your desk drawer.
You got through that wonderfully. Did you come wanting to say anything? Did you come with any thoughts of, I want to make sure that you haven't said?
Nope. I think we've covered it all and more.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. And how can people be in touch with you if they want to?
I have a Facebook page, Pastor Jason Dillingham. For me, as a pastor, I have the Table Faith Community, is also on Facebook and Instagram. If they happen to be in the Lakeview, Michigan area and they want to connect with a UCC church that's extravagantly welcoming, there is the Lakeview United Church of Christ page, where I am interim pastor right now. But really, probably the Table on Facebook and Instagram is the place you find us.
Okay.
Easiest.
Wonderful. And is that a group or a page on Facebook?
A page.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.